Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and welcome to this part of Decarbonising Transport Week, the UK's official National Awareness Week, which is going to be discussing a very interesting area of decarbonisation, and that is aviation, probably an area that I think doesn't get enough airtime, really. And I think, if you pardon the pun, that was an accident, not a cliche. And hopefully we'll put that right this morning. We're thankful at Decarbonising Transport Week for our sponsors, their support, Trojan Energy and Mott MacDonald, and also for the support of our supporting organisations. There are too many to mention, but we have mentioned them on our website at decarbonizingtransportweek.com. So have a look at that, and you can see a whole array of different organisations, the vast majority of whom, in fact, all of whom, are doing great work on the decarbonising agenda. As I say, this morning's session is on aviation, perspectives and strategies for a greener future. And we've got a brilliant panel, and I'm really excited to hear what they've got to say to us this morning. We've got Kim Yates from the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. We've got Helena Bennett from the Green Alliance. We've got Nour Eid, who is from the who's from the Aerospace Technology Institute. Colin Tattam from Innovate UK Business Connect, and Annabel Sarling from the Low Carbon Contracts Company. And I know that their insights hopefully are going to illuminate this discussion on aviation no end. Without further ado, I'm going to move to our first speaker, who is Dr. Kim Yates. Kim is chair of the Climate Change Advocacy Group at the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, which is one of the leading business associations in the infrastructure sector. And I know that Kim is very knowledgeable on all things to do with sustainability. She's going to be looking at some of the challenges faced by the aviation sector to decarbonise, not just the planes themselves, but the airports and the supporting infrastructure. So, Kim, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction, and I'm hoping that I'll do our members justice as I talk about decoding net zero in the aviation sector. So you hit it on the head, Andy, is that although 95% of the emissions are associated with the planes themselves, there's an awful lot that the airports can be doing that's within their control in terms of how they're getting people to and from the airport, what they're doing in terms of the energy consumption of the airport itself, and also how they're influencing how they're maintaining the asset and how they're taking forward construction. We know that 2020, 2.5% of the global carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, were attributed to aviation. It's a small amount, but it's very, very visible and very emotive to people because you see the planes, you see the emissions. But if you compare it to the concrete industry, depending on which figures you look at, they are responsible for 9 to 15% of the global emissions. But again, it's less visible. What we're seeing across the board, especially since COVID, is that there has been a resurgence in the aviation industry. And as you use more planes, etc., with that 95%, the emissions are going to go up, and the greenhouse gas emissions are going to go up. So the climate change impacts are going to increase unless something's done about it. Now, I was going to talk about hydrogen and various fuels, etc., but we've got Nour on the line here, so he'll be able to go into it much, much more in depth in terms of technical. But one of the big transition fuels is sustainable aviation fuel. And again, I'm not going to steal Helena's thunder because I'm sure that she'll be going into it in more depth, but certainly it's all about a planned decarbonisation, looking at what you can influence and what you can control, but a vast amount of it is influence and working together and collaborating. Again, don't forget, if you're hitting net zero, you have to reduce the absolute emissions from aviation, the airport, surface access, etc., by 90% by 2050 and offset the rest. And actually getting all this to work together in a combined way isn't simple. So I'll leave it to the floor, who will go into much more detail than I can.
Kim, thanks very much for that, and thanks for previewing our speakers, which is excellent. We'll get you to chair the next session. So hang on the line, the line for that. But it's good to see that you're pulling it all together in the round, which is excellent. Our next speaker is Helena Bennett, who is the head of climate policy at the Green Alliance. For those not familiar with Green Alliance, they're an independent think tank, an NGO, and some of the work that they do is just, well, frankly, fantastic. And I would urge people who aren't familiar with it just to go online and search Green Alliance. There's all kinds of information on their website. Helena's going to talk about the current state of aviation policy in the UK and what the government is doing or not doing to get there. So, Helena, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So, yeah, there are Green Alliance, in case you haven't heard of us, we're an independent think tank NGO. As Andy said, we work across a variety of sectors. We do a lot of work on the natural environment, on the economy. We have a whole political strategy arm as well, and the team I head up looks primarily at net zero and decarbonisation, which includes things like the energy sector, alternative fuels, the power sector and renewables, heat and buildings, and transport is one of our biggest areas of work as well. And within transport, we work across everything really, but aviation forms quite a big part of our work. And what's really great about being able to look across all those different sectors that Green Alliance specialises in is having an understanding of how the system fits together. So not just looking at aviation in a silo, but actually working out how it fits with the need to build more infrastructure and to decarbonise buildings and other forms of transport, and what that means for things like hydrogen supply in the UK. But as we see it, there are three main strands to decarbonising aviation that will be used going forward up to 2050 and beyond, not just in the UK, but around the world. One of those is sustainable aviation fuels that Kim mentioned. Those are alternative fuels that aren't fossil derived, so they aren't derived directly from fossil fuels dug out of the ground, but they do still burn greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There is still combustion happening in the sky and greenhouse gases being emitted. So although you often see kind of claims about reduction in emissions by X% with a certain amount of sustainable aviation fuels, that's on a life cycle analysis basis rather than actually completely cutting emissions in the sky. So worth bearing that in mind when we talk about SAF. And we can perhaps later talk about the different types of SAF there are as well, because some SAF is better than others, believe it or not. Then the other second kind of technological route is through zero-emission flights, and I know Nour's going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. We've recently done a piece of work, a briefing on kind of laying the groundwork for the policy frameworks that we think are needed to commercialise and scale up zero-emission flights in the UK. Those will primarily really be through using hydrogen, whether that's hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen combustion, so actually burning hydrogen in the atmosphere. But in theory, those will have no carbon emissions, possibly some contrails from water vapour from the chemical reactions happening with hydrogen, but that there might be good innovations to get rid of that water vapour as well, in which case the planes would be completely zero emission. And then the final third pillar is about managing demand. So at the moment, the UK government projects an increase of 75% in the amount of flying that's going to happen by 2050, so nearly doubling the amount of flying that we're seeing today. In a world where SAF hasn't scaled properly and we don't have commercialized zero-emission flights, it feels like it's an interesting route to take to say we're actually nearly going to double the amount of flying we're doing, even though we don't have this proven technology yet. So Green Alliance's stance is that we should be considering not growing the industry until this technology starts to prove that it can reduce emissions. The Climate Change Committee in the UK, the kind of government's advisors on climate change, say that we shouldn't have any airport expansion until 2035, so not increasing capacity in the UK until we start to see these emissions reductions, and that's a line that Green Alliance has taken and agrees with as well. And in terms of methods of actually managing demand, restricting airport expansion is one way. There are other things like introducing a tax on kerosene that might have an impact on frequent flyers, and obviously a frequent flyer levy is probably the term that a lot of people have heard of. And the other thing just to mention that we've talked about a lot recently is introducing specific taxes for private jets, which are incredibly undertaxed at the moment. They could be really good routes to commercialising things like zero-emission flights, but at the moment there's no kind of policy and regulation on private jets to make that happen. So yeah, hopefully that's a good summary of what we're up to and what's kind of going on in the UK.
Thanks very much, Helena. I look forward to politicians having a look at the taxing of private jets. That'll create some conversation in the general election campaign, I'm sure. But anyway, my tongue is only slightly in cheek in making that point. Our next speaker is Nour Eid, who is the head of strategy and commercial at the Hydrogen Capability Network and the Aerospace Technology Institute. Nour's role is primarily to work with government, industry and academia to enable the research and testing of hydrogen in the UK's aerospace sector. And I know he's going to talk about some of that work right now. Nour.
Brilliant, Andy. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. So yeah, thanks for having me. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the Aerospace Technology Institute. So I know today's webinar is around decoding net zero aviation, but our focus is more on aerospace. So some of the on-aircraft technologies required to enable net zero in the future. We were set up in 2014. Our vision is to transform the UK aerospace sector through technology and innovation. The ATI, we're an independent, non-for-profit organisation, and we're joint funded by government and industry. We define the National Aerospace Technology Strategy for the UK, and all of that is with the aim really of achieving net zero carbon emissions for commercial aircraft by 2050. So we do that through a number of different ways. The primary means really of achieving that is through the ATI programme, which supports mid-TRL research and technology in the UK. And over the past decade, so we're just coming to our 10-year anniversary, but over the last 10 years, we've supported over 400 projects in our portfolio. We've awarded close to £3 billion in grant funding to organisations. So with the industry contribution on top, that equates to a total portfolio of over £5 billion. Apart from the ATI programme, we've just launched the SME programme, which is targeted at supporting SMEs with grants up to 1.5 million. We've also got the ATI Hub, which is targeted at supporting innovators and startups from within the sector and those from outside the sector looking to get into aerospace. And Hydrogen Capability Network, the HCN, which I've been working on for the past year. So the HCN, we're coming to the end of phase 0, which is a 12-month program to identify what the sector really requires in terms of test capability, liquid hydrogen supply, research and skills in order to enable that next generation of hydrogen and zero emission aircraft. We're currently, as I mentioned, we're coming to an end of phase 0, which is at the end of this month, and we're currently in discussions with the Department for Business over in government to define what phase 1 programme looks like from April onwards. And in the past year, we've really been compiling requirements from across the sector through workshops, site visits, surveys, etc., to determine what's really required to enable zero carbon flight in the future. So some of the things which we're looking at, which hopefully we can discuss a little bit later, but we're looking at what research is required to develop hydrogen. So looking at materials testing and standards in the first instance, but looking forward to see what other research programs are required as well. Development of liquid hydrogen test hubs in the UK, where UK manufacturers can come and test their components or systems in a representative liquid hydrogen environment. Looking at what skills are required to develop the UK's knowledge base, and continuing to work with the sector to really identify what needs are out there. So that's a little bit around the ATI and the HCN, the Hydrogen Capability Network. And yeah, look forward to answering some questions later on.
Thanks, Nour, for that. We'll certainly dive into some of those questions a little bit later. Just to remind our audience that if you do have any questions, please post them in the questions box, funnily enough, which is in the one of the many dialogue boxes, I think, that you'll be looking at on your screen at the moment, but it's the one that says questions. So please post any questions for our panelists in that box. Our next speaker is Colin Tattam, who is the Executive Director for Net Zero and Sustainable Industries at Innovate UK Business Connect. And I know that Colin is going to talk a little bit about how the UK's capabilities for net zero aviation are going to be delivered. So Colin, it's your turn now.
Thank you for that. And yes, I think Innovate UK Business Connect, we're also proud to be a member of the Jet Zero Council. And as you say, today I want to talk about delivering UK capabilities for net zero aviation. So I do want to reflect a bit on our context. And when you get to this point in the session, it's hard not to repeat a bit of what's been said already. But relevant context here, I mean, unsurprisingly, aviation is global. So delivering net zero carbon for aviation truly is only going to be possible through an international approach. But I think within that context in the UK, we certainly do have strengths. And I think we can rightfully claim to be leading in a number of areas. I think one strength that we do have that might not seem that tangible, but it really is that we have an industry that knows that it needs to change. In 2020, we were the first aviation industry in the world to commit to net zero by 2050. And since that time, global airlines and indeed global governments have made that same commitment. So yeah, today I want to talk a bit about delivering UK capabilities for net zero aviation. At Innovate UK Business Connect, it's our role in this space and across sectors to connect and convene across sector boundaries, across technology boundaries, across stakeholder boundaries to accelerate the innovations that will drive progress against sustainability goals such as these. I think one example, if you want to look it up, is we'll be talking a number of times today about SAF, but I'll say it again, Sustainable Aviation Fuel's supply chain initiative. We're delivering a convening event in May that brings together over 500 global players from industry, academia, government, investors, and NGOs from across the supply chain to accelerate development and deployment in this space. I think the other relevant piece of context I wanted to touch on has been touched on already, but passenger numbers are now pretty much back to pre-pandemic levels. They're projected to grow, as we've heard, in the region of 70 to 80% by 2050. So I think decarbonising an industry like this one is challenging enough in steady state, but that's not, even that level of discomfort is not where we are. So to realise our ambitions, indeed our commitments, collaboration is absolutely key across those industry sectors with supportive government, talented, relevant academic capability. And we're here to help make that happen. I think the Jet Zero Council and its members, some of which are on this call, is making this happen. So it would be good to touch on some of this today.
Thanks very much for that, Colin. And I'm sure we will explore some of those questions at the time that we have available. Our final panelist is Annabel Sarling, and Annabel is Policy and Commercial Development Lead at the Low Carbon Contract Company. And I know that Annabel is going to talk about the application and journey of the contract for differences system that applies in the energy sector and how that has synergies with the aviation industry. So Annabel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'm really excited to be on this panel today. And yes, the Low Carbon Contracts Company is really proud to have helped develop what were over sort of around 10 years ago, really new energies, and essentially work with suppliers and work with the government, as we are an arm's length body of government, to develop these industries and these energies into what are now really sort of mature and I suppose sort of like well-functioning markets. I believe in sort of 2010, only 7% of UK electricity generation was made up of renewables, and now it's over 40%. Offshore wind being one of the most potentially well-known success stories on the contract from the contract for difference mechanism, but it supported many other energy sources such as solar, biomass conversion, and the contract for difference, or sort of private law contract, is a really sort of like unique mechanism that provides risk allocation to sort of areas of low carbon electricity that actually, I suppose, without this form of support mechanism wouldn't necessarily be able to develop. So we've been working with the Department of Transport and discussing how the CFD was used, and actually looking at the challenge sustainable aviation fuels are facing, and trying to apply our sort of, I suppose, success measures that have worked really well for offshore wind, for example, and onshore wind, and trying to see if those can, I suppose, help the aviation industry get where it needs to be. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annabel. Right, we now have a challenge, not as big of a challenge as decarbonising the UK, well, the world's, as Colin reminded us, aviation sector. But we've got questions to fit in, and we've got 5 panelists. So I'm going to do my level best to accommodate everyone. He says, taking 30 seconds of their time just with that blathering introduction. I want to turn to Kim first of all. Key question, really. Do you think we will have hydrogen-fueled planes in the next decade?
So, yes. I think they're going to be in the test phase. I don't think they're going to be commercially available. I think one of the biggest issues at the moment is in terms of, and again, Nour can speak much more eloquently to this than I can, is the issue of actually getting the hydrogen in the planes and having enough room for the passengers. So it actually makes it economically viable to have a hydrogen plane. But I'm very conscious that there is a lot of research going on behind the scenes to look at trying to overcome this problem in terms of getting the hydrogen on the plane, getting it nice and safe, and being able to have the passengers on there at the same time, but also make it economically viable. And I think certainly from what I've seen, that is one of the biggest issues at this moment in time. But I think we will have hydrogen planes. Maybe not lots and lots of them, but I think they will be there.
Okay, thanks, Kim, for that. I'll be back to you. I've got a couple of more questions I want to ask you in a little while. Just turning to Helena for a second. Sustainable aviation fuel is a key plank of one of those 3 main strands that you spoke about. Some people would argue that it isn't, or that it's cracked up to be. What would your view be on that?
Yeah, I would also share that sentiment. We often hear about alternative fuels and the way the government talks about alternative fuels, SAF, as the industry calls it, in a very positive way, and with this caveat of, it's how we'll achieve guilt-free flying, and it's one of the key ways we're going to decarbonise aviation in the next 10 to 15 years. There are some serious questions that need to be answered about different types of SAF. So broadly speaking, there's a few different buckets. So one is what we call e-fuels. You might have heard it called e-kerosene or power to liquid fuel. If derived from carbon dioxide directly captured from the air and green hydrogen made from renewables, then it's the only alternative fuel that offers a completely circular carbon option, still has non-CO2 impacts when burned in the air, but can be considered net zero carbon. Problem is we don't have much hydrogen, and we don't have commercialized direct air capture in the UK, so it's not at the moment a viable, scalable option. It will be quite expensive, but it is probably the best alternative fuel out there. Then you've got things like waste-derived fuels, biofuels, and a lot of types of biofuels have been ruled out of being used in the UK because we don't want to use crops that could be used for food as fuel instead. Then there are things like used cooking oil can be used to make alternative fuels, but the problem is there's a limited amount of that as well. And then fuels that are derived from waste, there's a limited amount of waste. And what we don't want to do is see the government try and scale up these fuels that are actually using kind of byproducts and waste products already to a position where we have to create more byproducts and waste products to meet our fuel demands. There are a lot of unanswered questions about how all these different bits of the puzzle square away, and at the moment we don't really have answers for a lot of them. And then when you scale that up to the level that's going to be required across the world, because obviously the aviation industry is a global industry, we're looking at basically not being able to meet demand fully. And then on top of that, just reiterating what I said earlier, these are still fuels that are being burned in the air, and the immediate issue that we've got is reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So regardless of where the fuel comes from, if it's fossil derived or not, if we're still burning it in the atmosphere and greenhouse gases are being emitted, that's still a problem, and that's the thing we're trying to eradicate. So I think they can play a limited role, but I don't think they're, the way that they're being spoken about in the press and by the government is not the reality, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks for that, Helena. There's obviously a bigger picture here, which I'm going to refer to with a number of our panelists in a moment. But I just want to turn to Nour for a second. What should we be focusing on when it comes to decarbonising aviation? Is it SAF, hydrogen, batteries? We already mentioned some of the other greener fuel sources. What should we really be focusing on there if we're going to enable zero emission flight in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That's a great question. And look, in short, it's all of the above. And Helena's touched on that a little bit there. But in order to achieve net zero, there's no silver bullet for the sector. It's a difficult to decarbonize, highly technological sector, and we need to be pushing everything that you just said. And I think a lot of the panelists and maybe a lot of people on the call will be familiar with the graph of what we need to do to achieve net zero in the future by 2050. It's made up of many different slices, and that looks at continued fuel efficiency for today's fleet, increased electrification of this generation and next generation technologies, increased use of hydrogen, increased use of sustainable aviation fuels, and Helena's mentioned the different types there, increasing the operational efficiency of how we fly our aircraft and what that looks like in the sky, and airport operations on the ground as well, and also considering the effects of non-CO2 emissions, so studying the effects of contrails as well. And look, we need to be looking at all of those in order to decarbonize aviation in the future. I'll just say quickly, I didn't reach my mute button in time, but for Kim's question, we've got hydrogen aircraft flying at the moment. So we've got some small companies who are testing gaseous hydrogen aircraft today. We had a liquid hydrogen small aircraft fly in Germany last year. So is it achievable by 10 years time? It depends on the scale, but we've got hydrogen aircraft flying now. So it is in test phase. There's still plenty more to come, but yeah, just to go back to the question you asked, Kim, there as well.
Thanks, Nour, for that. If I can just ask our panelists to be as brief as they can be while explaining some of these complex issues. I want to turn to Colin now. It seems to me that there's a lot of moving parts to all of this, and a lot of big challenges, and it isn't just down to the usage of aviation. But given all of that, can aviation never truly become net zero? Are we trying to bite off more than we can chew here?
Yeah, that's a big question for someone who's just asked for concise answers. So I think, can aviation ever truly be net zero? I mean, there's a bit of emphasis on the word truly there, but I think the short answer is yes, if we're talking about net zero rather than absolute zero. And I think the answer has to be yes. But as we've heard already, it doesn't mean that it's not complex and it's not challenging, because it's certainly both of these things. So I think it is technically feasible. I think I'm feeling a little bit more positive around the role of staff than some on the call, because I think, as Nour has described, you know, we're navigating our way through a number of parallel pathways that work in combination to deliver our ambitions to 2050. And I certainly think the smart utilisation of SAF, acknowledging the challenges around scale of production and the credentials of various different types of SAF is a critical component here. But we have to do all the other things as well. We need more fuel efficient, more aerodynamic aircraft. We need to look at those alternative fuels. We've spoken about hydrogen, and that is hydrogen combustion, as well as hydrogen electric propulsion systems. We also need innovations in operational changes, you know, improving air traffic management to drive efficiencies there. And I think finally, trying to keep this concise, you know, reducing emissions directly from aviation operations is essential, but it's going to be really challenging to eliminate those entirely. So the engineered greenhouse gas removals, yes, are not available at scale, certainly not in the UK, but for example, things like direct air capture, they will have a role to play in contributing to the portfolio approach that will deliver net zero for us by 2050.
Thanks, Colin. I'm going to come to Kim in a minute with a question about airport infrastructure, but before I do, I just want to ask Annabel a question. Obviously, this whole area is risky, to put it mildly. We're talking about new nascent technologies, innovation, and whenever you start talking about innovation, in my experience, and I might be doing them a disservice here, lawyers become a little bit nervous, and the contract world starts to, you know, really go into sometimes a bit of a bunker mentality. So how does how does contract design deal with this kind of, you know, new technology, this risky kind of area, you know, in your view?
Thank you so much. So LCCC, we've used the private law contract in many different ways. It's never a case of eliminating risks. It's a case of allocating risks depending on the risks the technology faces. So, for example, private law contracts have been really successful in mitigating technology construction risk. Often less mature technologies face increased risk or delays during the construction and operational phase. Within the contracts, projects can receive a grace period to build and fully commission projects, which actually otherwise left sort of without this private law contract mechanism of protection, there would be really limited protections. I think as well, I've sort of been hearing a lot about sales or sort of market price risk in, again, sort of like nascent technologies. And again, the CFD payment largely insulates projects from wholesale market fluctuations. So actually that means that sort of like their projects are sort of protected in negative price situations when demand for the product is absent. So I think that sort of really like touches upon what a lot of people have been saying, that actually, you know, it's going to have to be a mixed approach, but they're still all really sort of in early development phases, and that provides protection. And actually, I think something that at the LCCC we've been really sort of happy to see is it still allows for, I suppose, more kind of like natural development of these markets. So it's even though there is, I suppose, you know, it does intervene in the market, it still allows for freedom for like innovation. The contracts aren't sort of very restrictive in terms of like allowing for, you know, further, I suppose, further decarbonisation technology to be added. And I think as well, once sectors get used to working with a contract for difference mechanism, actually, you know, we've had like lots of amazing feedback from our generators, and it becomes a really sort of like collaborative approach with the LCCC as the counterparty, working with the government and then generators and industry. So it sort of makes for a sort of way more collaborative supply chain, because you're looking at individual sort of like and unique risks that each technology faces. And for feedstocks, which I know is a big sort of part of the SAF technology, low carbon technologies sort of don't necessarily have feedstocks, but feedstock generators like biomass and energy from waste actually sort of don't have feedstock provisions as such, but there are other provisions in place that actually allow for sort of like development risks to take place. And I know that that's Helena, what you were sort of saying actually is that we don't necessarily want to prop up certain and sort of incentivize certain behaviors within the market. And I think that's why sort of CFD can be used as a really, really powerful tool, is that you can decide actually where you want to mitigate risks and where you actually think that it's reasonable for there to be a continued risk.
Thanks, Annabel. I want to look at maybe the bigger picture here, because it isn't just about the planes, is it? It's also about, planes fly from somewhere, and they're called airports. So what about decarbonising airport infrastructure? I know a lot of UK airports are extremely focused on how they do that, and I wonder whether or not, Kim, you've got any reflections on that, and maybe you've even worked with some, because I know that as well as being chair of the Climate Change Advocacy Group for the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, I know you're also a sustainability lead at McDonald as well. So your thoughts on that, Kim?
So we know, well, as you said, we work with a lot of clients in the aviation sector. With my other hat on, I happen to be a decarbonisation specialist. But in terms of the infrastructure, the assets, etc., yes, the airports want to decarbonise, but the planning has to start now. The space proofing for SAF, for hydrogen, or whatever needs to be put in place now. And that takes a lot of investment. So again, I think we've all touched on, it's a very complex area that we're working in. There is no silver bullet, as Nour beautifully put it. And it is a mixture of different things that you need to put in there. Is it going to be an electric plane, hydrogen? Is there going to be cold fusion in 2040? Who knows at this point in time? But the airports now have to be planning for whatever is out there in the future. And they need that investment. What we're seeing within the UK is that there is some investment in this, but in the EU, for example, they're pumping a lot of money into specific airports to make them SAF hubs, look at hydrogen technologies, etc. So it's going back to the techie bit is, I won't say relatively straightforward, but it's there. It's actually all the other enablers. So Annabel again put it quite nicely in terms of the contracting, the sharing of risk. All these other enablers need to be put in place. In theory, we can get UK airports to net zero by 2040 on a good day. From a technical perspective, and again, the technologies are there, it's all the other pieces of the puzzle that you have to get all the stars aligned to be able to do that. So it's, yeah, I'd love to say that, in 40 minutes we have decoded net zero for aviation. I think there's going to be a lot longer than that, than this we can answer on this panel session.
Okay, I'm actually just going to continue for a little bit longer, because I just want to get to, I want to come back to that 2040 issue in a minute. But just before I do, I just want to ask Helena, because it seems to me that this isn't, I think that, this is a complex issue. It's not just about planes. It's not even just about the airports. It's about people's behavior as well. And as with so many things in relation to sustainability and net zero, we've got to start changing people's behavior. So I would ask you, Helena, how can we bring, and I want people to be very brief now, because as I say, we've only got about 5 minutes left. How can we bring people on board with adjusting their behaviours when it comes to aviation, in a nutshell? I know it's complicated, but we're having to deal with sound bites, I'm afraid.
No, totally fine. Just to related, just to pick up on something Kim just said about investment, we believe that the sector should be paying for all this stuff itself and not relying on the public purse in a big way, because 50% of people in the UK don't fly in any given year, and 70% of flights are taken by 15% of the population. So this is not an equitable form of travel. It is really isolated to quite a particular portion of the public. And so we don't think it should be paid for out of taxpayers' pockets. Related to that, it means that behaviour change really has to come from a group of people that can actually afford to do the behaviour change. You know, if you look at like short haul flights, domestic routes in the UK, short haul flights in Europe, there are train services, rail services that will get you between A and B. It might take a bit longer, and it is a bit more expensive at the moment, but it can be done. It's completely possible to get from, you know, London to Madrid or some, you know, Paris, Berlin by train, and those with the most funds are most able to do it. So there is an element of behaviour change. I think there is a bit of a question over, you know, 1 in 10 flights is made on a private jet. It's contributing significantly to the way that we perceive aviation, and business flights and first class flights are anywhere between 3 and 9 times as polluting as economy flights. So even within that already elite proportion of the population that flies, there is another level of eliteness on private jets and those other kind of flights that are even more polluting. So it's really difficult to talk about in terms of behaviour change, because it is a big kind of cultural shift that would need to happen, and we're not necessarily advocating for people not ever flying again or cutting the amount people fly significantly, but frequent flyers, I think, should start to be charged more seriously for the amount of polluting that they're doing, and hopefully that would lead to a change in behaviours and people deciding to, you know, not go on that business flight that they have been asked to go on, or not go on their 4th holiday of the year, or decide to get the train to Edinburgh instead of flying. So there are lots of things that can be done, and government needs to take a really leading role. And at the moment, we've got a Prime Minister that's flying here, there and everywhere on a private jet. So it's not really setting a very good example for people, you know, around the country that are thinking about how they travel.
Thanks for that. As a confirmed, I won't say train spotter, but I'm a big fan of the trains. I would train it everywhere if I could. But sometimes the people who pay my bills won't actually pay the massive train bill that it would cost for me to go to, I don't know, the south of France, for example, although I don't go there much for work. I just want to quickly ask Nour a question. And notwithstanding all the complicating factors and the challenges and all the rest of it, what do you think we need to do now to speed up aviation's journey to a net zero future? And just if you can try and answer that in literally a sentence, because I'm going to go around our virtual table here and ask people to answer a different question in one sentence. So your views on that, Nour?
Absolutely, no worries. I think what we need to do more than anything is just to start doing. So there's been a lot of planning in terms of everything that we've discussed so far. We need to start doing, particularly with hydrogen. We haven't got a big history of space technology like they do in sort of America or Germany. So we need to start doing, playing with the fuel, understanding how it works, and doing all of the things mentioned by the other panelists.
Thanks, Nour. Variation on that question, Colin. What's standing in the way of progress at the minute, and how can we address it in the UK?
Gosh, so I'll talk about sustainable aviation fuels, I think, and hydrogen just really briefly. But I think with the deployment of SAF, I think scaled production of SAF, that we know the sustainability credentials, it's not clear to see how we're going to scale to the megaton quantities that we need to have 10% in mix by 2030. I think hydrogen, you know, that's a vector that's part of a number of energy intensive industries' decarbonisation plans. Green hydrogen is clearly the where we want to be going. So there's effectively industries competing in demand for that feedstock. So strategy around that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Colin. Annabel, and I'm going to have to ask you to be brief as well. Is the contract sector, the legal sector, is it going to keep pace with a lot of this new stuff that's going on? How can we be confident that you're actually going to support the sector and deliver? I know it's not your job alone, but
So the LCCC is really proud to have been awarded the counterparty role for hydrogen, and hydrogen production business model contracts are actually looking to provide over 2 billion of revenue for the hydrogen production business model, and that was in the hydrogen allocation round 1. So I think that sort of, and I know hydrogen sort of come up a lot in this webinar, so hopefully that responds to your question on the contract mechanism supporting. Thank you.
And thanks very much, Annabel. And Helena, I'm going to ask you to stargaze a little bit. If you were in charge of the policy manifestos for the general election, what do you think would be the single thing in this area that would make a real difference to getting it right?
I think the introduction of at first low-level kerosene tax across all aviation at a really low rate that ramps up over time would help with managing demand in the future, with funding for SAF and zero-emission flight innovation research, and would also just set the scene about the fact that aviation is not at the moment paying its fair share of taxes for how polluting it is as an industry.
Thanks very much. And finally, Kim, trying to maybe draw some strands together a little bit. You mentioned that on a good day, you thought that UK airports could be net zero by 2040. Give us some real cause for optimism about how we can link and join all of this up and basically achieve it.
I suppose what we're seeing across the aviation sector is that they realise that, as you said, Helena, it is highly polluting. It's a very polluting industry, and they realise that they have to do something for it. And they're working incredibly hard to do that, but whilst in the context of trying to keep commercially viable. So again, from it's behavioural change, but it's also that pull from the industry to say, okay, we've got to do something about this. We know that if we want an industry, if we want a sustainable industry, we've got to make a big difference here.
Thanks very much, Kim. What a great discussion we've had there. We've gone over a little bit, but I think we had to do that. If there's anyone from government watching, and you never know, there might be, or even the next government, if indeed it changes, you've got your panel here to sort out aviation and its decarbonisation. There's no question about that in my mind. Thanks very much to Annabel, to Nour, to Colin, to Kim and Helena for what's been, I think, an excellent discussion, as I said before, on an issue that I don't think gets enough, and I was trying not to use the phrase airtime, but I've just had to use it again. What can I say? Thanks very much to all of you. This has been Andy Walker chairing this session of Decarbonising Transport Week. Join us in about 15 minutes time, where we've got a very interesting interview coming up with an expert in the area of advanced air mobility, and I know that I'm going to learn a lot from that session, if nothing else. So thanks again to all of our panel. Thanks to our audience for listening, and we'll see you in the next session. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Andy. Bye-bye.